Get the lay of the land. Get the lay of the land. For several weeks now, we have looked at the book of Acts in part through the eyes of Tom, who runs the best body and auto shop in Doe Run, Texas. East Texas behind the Pine Curtain. It's the best one in the county. Now, Tom had a daddy who was a fountain of folk wisdom and good old-fashioned common sense. Tom's daddy, in fact, was a legend, and many people knew his sayings. Now, again, talking about Tom, his father passed away when he was in his mid-20s. So they had a good relationship, and after his father passed away, Tom began to write down what's things that Daddy would say about this or that. Wisdom, advice that he had given, and in fact, would spend time the next several years talking with people who knew his father, just saying, now what did Daddy talk about this? And make a list, began to compile almost a book of wisdom of his father. He noticed a series of sayings, think about a dozen sayings that his father used with great frequency, advice sayings, and one of them was, get a lay of the land. Now, like most good bits of folk wisdom, you can apply it in a lot of situations. It's knowing something about your physical surroundings. The idea when you drive somewhere, check the landmarks. You've got to have to get out too, especially if it's new. Know your landmarks on the way out. It includes such things as that. It includes when you go into a situation, know the dynamics. Who are the people there? The personalities, the relationships. Figure that out pretty quick as you can between the people. And always when a situation, know what's gone before. And if there's some sense of where it's going, have a good idea of what that is. To understand the situation, you have to get the lay of the land. As we continue our journey through Acts, it's good for us to get the lay of the land. It has begun with Paul, great anti-Christian, coming to Christ. It involves Peter working with Cornelius, expanding their idea of to whom can come to Christ and how. That is good news for the Gentiles, and they can go straight to Christ without becoming Jewish first. It is knowing about the role of Barnabas and knowing the idea of sometimes things happen, quite frankly. There's separations between people. It's knowing the story and how it happened that they went to Philippi, the first church founded in Europe. And who was the people that made up that group? Getting a lay of the land, then knowing what follows. Now, originally, I was going to call this sermon A Tale of Three Cities. We're focusing on Berea. That's the middle of the three cities. It's Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens. To understand the story of Berea, you've got to understand what happened before and what happened afterwards. So I want to get us a lay of the land, and then tie it down to Berea, how that applies to Doe Run, Texas, and how it applies to us. Now, the story goes, after they leave Philippi, they go to Thessalonica. It is 45 miles away. So if you got your car, you left the parking lot and drove to downtown Fort Worth. That's almost exactly what it is, okay? So, I don't know, mentally, if you're already on the road, fine. Be sure to make that turn on 80 and get to 30. But basically, that's the distance they have traveled. The next city along the way, you may know of that city today as Salonika in Greece. So anyway, that's where they go, and is, as Paul's custom, he goes to the synagogue. And this city has enough Jewish people in it that they can have an actual synagogue. Remember, Philippi did not. They did not have the required minimum of 10 men to form a synagogue. So Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days argued with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This is the Messiah, Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you." The full story, just look at Acts 17, you'll get all of it there. And so he proclaims for 3 weeks. Now, notice the reactions. Some of the Jewish people respond. More responded among the God-fearers. Those are the Gentiles, Greek-speaking Gentiles typically, who came to synagogue, who believed in God, who worshiped, who prayed, who sang, who heard the lessons taught and sat in their Gentile section because they had not made the final step of formal conversion to Judaism. That group responds very well. In particular, some women of influence joined the band as well. Well, everything gets stirred up, as often is the case with Paul, and a mob goes to the house of Jason. That was where they were staying. Now, Paul and company were actually out at the time, which is good, and probably avoided a lynching. But the people come there, and they realize they're not there. They cause trouble. They go before the officials and saying they're disturbing the peace. They're challenging the Roman way. And so Jason is forced to give a bond. If they don't leave town, I have to pay you money, basically. And so Paul and company leave town. Now, actually, as a result of this, that's why we have the letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He's writing back to the people there. He had to leave quickly, and that's how we ended up with those letters. Well, then they go from there to Berea. Now, notice again, though, in Thessalonica, the 3 reactions. Some respond, and some reject, and some reject and rebel. That's the kind of response they're getting. They go on then to Berea, which again, like I said, it's 45 miles away. It's like getting in your car and driving to downtown Fort Worth. Now, they go there, and once again he goes to the synagogue, and it says that there are some more noble-minded people in Berea. They received the word with eagerness. They examined the Scriptures. And again, we see reactions from the people. There's them, some of them responded. That is, the Jewish people responded. Greek men and Greek women responded. And here, it's very specific. And I use an older translation. So it says men and women. That literally is what was found. Both respond. And then some reject. However, there's another response of those who reviewed. They may have rejected, but many of them then responded and accepted. There's a sense of let's review, let's examine what's been said. Well, folks from Thessalonica make the trek to Berea and they get things stirred up. And so Paul goes on to Athens. He's able to leave Timothy and Silas behind there in Berea. He goes on to Athens. Now imagine for somebody like Paul to be in Athens. He is Greek speaking. That is his first language. He learned his scriptures in the Greek translation. He lives in Tarsus. This is the culture that he knows firsthand. So in a way, these are his people. He has come back to the mother city of his culture. Yet for all of his sophistication, because Paul was an excellent student, it's still a case of country comes to town, and I'm sure he's feeling a little nervous. Yet, once again, he speaks, and he speaks to the people at the area where anybody can speak about anything, to the fact he's talking about an unknown God. It's not going to weird people out. They're used to all kinds of conversations. And he begins by talking to the people and saying, I see a very religious city. I saw the statue of an unknown God. He speaks of him and he quotes the poets that they would know. Again, this is his culture. He knows these people. And again, he gets 3 responses. Some people just sneer and reject. Some people, and I call this is the review group, we'll hear more later. You've given me something to think about. And some respond and accept. That is, in those settings, between those 3 cities, in the middle we have Berea. And there are 2 things that stand out for us today. They listened carefully first to understand. And then they studied the Scriptures diligently to determine what is true. They took time to study. I think that's one reason, as you might find, particularly since being a Baptist, but I've seen like a Berean Baptist church. Maybe you've passed one in your travels. That's why they picked the name Berea, okay? They studied. That's why it gives a good billing in terms of for what should you name your church. One sermon I came across in preparation contrasted the Thessalonians and the Bereans. It said the noble Thessalonians who basically just kicked them out, while the noble Bereans were willing to give others a fair hearing. And the pastor said, do we seek first to understand? Is that our goal? Do I first seek to understand? And then asked, do we study the Scriptures regularly to examine the beliefs of others? And constantly to examine and study our own beliefs. They were a group that was willing to listen and to study. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Jesus met Zacchaeus at the place of Zacchaeus' deepest need. I'm going to have supper with you today. I'm going to have dinner. That involves conversation. And Zacchaeus was more than ready to listen. Jesus did not begin with an attack of the tax practices. In fact, he never said one thing about in that setting about the practice of the tax collectors and how they went about their business. It was just being in the presence of the goodness of Christ that led Zacchaeus to make amends for his things. I mean, Jesus, again, could have harsh words for those in authority. They had pushed the button first. And always remember when that synagogue leader went to him and said, Jairus, my daughter needs help. Jesus went to help. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. And yes, he had words to say. People were willing to listen. And we see him listening to others. The Bereans were willing to give a fair hearing and then examine, to do their research. And from that, some rejected, some continued to reflect, and some responded. Well, what does that mean for the good folks in Doe-Run? Now, like I said, Tom lives there behind the pine curtain, and he's seen a lot of life. He grew up there and essentially has spent his life in that community. He's done some traveling, studied elsewhere, but that's always been home for him. And he sees people in all kinds of situations. When the car breaks down, when the traveler's coming through town, they always get a good recommendation. You'll be treated fairly there. So he sees people in their travels and often in great distress. People in the community. They need to get regular repair work done, or sometimes they're out on the road and say, Tom, I need you to come tow me in. He sees people in situations, and he's, like I said, his place is kind of like a barber shop or a beauty parlor. People just come and they talk. And Tom's a good listener. He doesn't make pronouncements. He'll ask some probing questions. He'll reflect back what he hears. He might say, now, have you ever thought about this? Well, let me tell you about a story. That reminds me of a story. And people that's usually what he does, and they draw their own conclusions. He's an informal counselor on the side. And when he's talking to them and they're presenting a situation, if he's not saying to them, well, you need to get a lay of the land, he's encouraging them to do that. Have you ever thought about this? Or you wonder why your brother-in-law thinks that way? What's his story?